Ghana is leading a historic charge at the UN to have the transatlantic slave trade officially recognized as the most serious crime against humanity. President John Mahama's goal is to move beyond just remembering the past as a tragedy and instead label it a formal, legal and moral crime. Now, this shift is vital because for centuries, the global systems built on slavery have never been fully held accountable. By getting the UN's official stamp on this definition, Ghana hopes to create a foundation for real healing and global justice. Now, this is not just about history books. It's a push for reparations and closing the wealth gap created by centuries of exploitation. Ghana points out the bitter irony that in the past, slave owners were often compensated for their losses while the victims received nothing. Now, by forcing a global conversation on apologies, the return of stolen artifacts and economic support, they're trying to fix a lopsided world order and ensure that the descendants of those affected finally see some form of restitution. Joining us on this conversation, we have Toby Green, Professor of African History, King's College, London, UK. And we also have Paul Ejime, African Affairs Analyst in London, UK as well. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us at this time.
Thank you, Darshan, for having us.
It's a pleasure.
Hey, Darshan, nice to be here.
So let me begin with you, Toby. There are arguments that this is a symbolic gesture. Legally speaking, if the UN adopts this specific wording, does it bypass the current statuses of limitations that Western nations use to dodge reparation claims?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I think it would be a mistake to see this as symbolic. I think clearly symbolism is very important, and so that would be a major step forward on that level. But we have to understand that abolition itself was a process, fundamentally a legal process. So there are various aspects to it. There were of course armed resistance efforts on the part and successful efforts on the part of enslaved Africans in the Americas, as well as on the continent. But the process of abolition itself was a legal process, and a recent book published by the historian from Guinea-Bissau, José Linha-Nafafe, shows that actually those efforts actually began in the 17th century with a prince from Angola, the King of Ndongo, taking a case to the Vatican for the legal abolition of slavery. So legal process matters, I think, in how that would then feed through into, as you say, the struggle for broader forms of reparative justice.
All right, now, still on you, Toby. Now, let's talk about the math, because a recent report by the Brattle Group estimated that the total reparations owed by 31 former slave-owning nations, exceeds $100 trillion. Now, given that the entire global GDP is around $105 trillion, are we discussing a realistic financial transfer, or is this proposal more about restructuring the debt of the global south?
I mean, it's such an enormous topic. I think clearly, when you put those figures before me, I mean, I'm an economic historian, but I'm not an economist. So I can't say, that figure is such a vast figure. I think it's entirely realistic, I have to say. We're talking about a process which took place over 3.5 centuries. We're talking about many factors, not only the enormities of enslavement of those who were enslaved and trafficked to the Americas, but also the long-term impacts, which, as your compatriot, the Nigerian historian Joseph Inekori, showed, was the long-term interruption of economic transformation processes on the continent. And so, when you take all of the factors into account, I don't think it's an unrealistic figure, but what that means in practice is obviously something different, and I think fundamentally it has to be to do with structural frameworks which continue to, as your viewers know all too well, have caused massive problems on the continent in the last 5 or 6 years, the last 20 years, let alone preceding centuries. So there are structural elements which, a sum alone won't necessarily resolve on its own. There have to be other efforts made, I think, beyond that.
Okay. Now let's hear Paul's thoughts, especially on the figures. What do you think, Paul? Do you think that what is actually being discussed, realistic financial transfer or, debt restructuring?
So I think the world has actually been unfair to Africa, and it's not, it's not something that usually developing countries and African issues are dealt with as a footnote. Really, there is nothing. You can't put an amount on what they did in slavery. About millions of people were just uprooted from their continent and taken, put into plantations. In Britain, the monarchy was involved, the church was involved, everybody was involved, and then, it's as if, and there have been reparations in other cases. But when it comes to Africa, this liturgy suddenly comes up. Why is it that up to now, there hasn't been any, even to render an apology has become a big issue, because they know that apology goes with accountability. So there is not that, I can't see any amount that you can really put on human head, and it tells you when they now begin to reduce it to this question of how much is going to be paid and what that, or who gets what. Then you now see the hypocrisy and insincerity of those who are talking about a world order that talks about justice and fair play, but here they are actually denying. They're in denial. Everybody was involved. The big companies in what is it called, Oxford, where there is a Codrington library. Codrington was a slave owner, and he used that money to build a library where you have the British, Center of Excellence, Academia, is in Oxford. Also, Liverpool, a place that you call like Liverpool. These were all proceeds that were, from slave trade. And here they are talking about whether it is going to be or not to be, or how much. Let there be a conscious and intentional, approach to it. To say, listen, here was an apartheid. There was the grievous human treatment of human. People were sent like sardines and shipped to another place. Apart from the inhuman nature of that, there was money. And like you said in your introduction, slave owners were compensated. I wrote a piece in 2007. I called it "Enough Sorrows, Time for Reparation." And my argument there, people can Google it and see, is that, listen, there is that, and it was when they were marking so-called 200th anniversary of the official abolition. Because even after the abolition, because of what they were getting, they continued, because it was so beneficial to them. They gained so much from it, because Africa was in a very bad, position, could not argue his case. So one will want to commend President Mahama for taking up this, and I will hope that the AU and other people, in fact, in Europe and America, CARICOM, Caribbean allies, there are people who are also not just Africans.
Yeah,
because this is a world and international problem that everybody should rally and make sure that there is, what is it called, put an end to it. But no, it's unfortunate.
All right, now we will definitely talk about CARICOM later, but let's come back to, more figures. This is for you, Toby. Ghana's proposal highlights a bitter historical irony. In 1833, the British government paid £20 million, that's about 40% of its national budget at the time, to compensate slave owners for their lost property. Now, people are asking why. Nearly 200 years later, why is it that the international community still is still more comfortable discussing the financial loss of the oppressor than the generational poverty of the victims? And just to add what Paul did say earlier, he said the world has been unfair to Africa, and the fact that they know that apology would go with accountability, and that's why we're not hearing any apology at all.
Yeah, I mean, I can only agree with that, and I want to add to what Paul was saying. I mean, I agree with what you're saying, rather, Paul. That it has to be conscious and it has to be intentional, and also in your introduction, Darshan, that you mentioned President Mahama's view that this would be part of a broader process of healing, and that has to be right. I mean, and I can only agree with everything that's been said. You know, what you said, Paul. You know, that the world has been utterly unjust in so many different ways to the legacies, the legacies of this, and well, in the initial historical moment, the utter inhumanity and cruelty of it, and then subsequently. And without healing, we can only look around the world and see the enormities of what is happening and conclude that the world is in a massive need of healing. And so this move could, would have enormous ramifications, and I can only hope that it is approved.
All right. Now, while Ghana is leading this charge, we've seen a fragmented response from other African nations as well. Is there a risk that the African Union is not speaking with one voice here? I mean, without a unified 54-nation bloc, does Ghana have the diplomatic muscle to push this through the UN Security Council? This is for you, Paul.
That has been the problem, that even the victims, they are pleading, I don't know, they are actually taking the position of their oppressors. And that is the issue. There hasn't been that African unity and consciousness to really push for this. In fact, in that article, I mentioned that some African leaders were saying that apology was enough, that how do you, how are you going to distribute the money? Who should be compensated? It's been a long time. And that is where they get it wrong. Because, and I know they are doing that essentially because of the, selfish end. Probably they have been, you will say they have been bought over, or that they cannot see the consciousness. Either they are not attuned with thank God Toby is there, to know that when you forget your history, if you don't follow history, will teach you its own lesson, if you don't learn the lesson of history. Why would they sweep this kind of situation under the carpet? And what do they now expect the slavers, what do they expect them to do? So there has to be, that kind of consciousness. But if they are not doing it, going to follow, let those who are pushing. You can even see more aggressive campaign from the CARICOM countries, other than the Mother Africa, from where these people were taken. And then again, there is also the dichotomy. You find the pushback by Africans in the diaspora, blaming the Africans at home for saying, well, it was your forefathers that sold us. And that is because they do not also understand history. What did the African kings get from there? Is it the mirror and all that? Compared to somebody who sat somewhere, organized a ship to go from thousands of kilometers to another country or another continent to begin to instigate, they caused some conflict to be able to catch slaves. And then they met these so-called leaders who were not really up to it, and started, catching people and putting them in Ghana. You go to the fort where they were pushing them to, what do you call them? Once you move to area of no return, you go to Senegal. These are proven evidence to back that this happened. So why would anybody be in denial? So I leave it to the Africans if they want to. You are saying, yes, AU probably is not in a position to do that. But even non-Africans who have seen that there is inhumanity, that there is, racial something to it, they have come up. So whoever remains behind, let those who do not want to acknowledge it, let them leave them behind and begin to push with it. That is what one will tell President Mahama.
Okay. All right, now coming back to you, Toby, this resolution also mentions the return of stolen artifacts. We know that the British Museum still holds over 900 Benin bronzes. Is a UN declaration the only way to force these institutions to stop treating African history as their private collection? Do you think that the museums will ignore returning these artifacts back to Nigeria?
Well, I mean, I'm glad you've asked me that question, Dorshan. I gave a lecture, you mentioned Liverpool, actually, Paul, and I gave a lecture last year at Liverpool's Museum, Centre for the Study of International Slavery on restitution with my colleague in the Gambia, director of the National Centre of Arts and Culture, Hassoun Cissé. And basically, it's absolutely clear that restitution is an important, I mentioned earlier the symbolic aspect of this, and clearly this is an absolutely fundamental symbolic aspect of the quest for reparations, because you know, the fact is that the economic and political injustices went with a massive sort of symbolic framework, which involved, yes, this looting of artifacts from the African continent, all around the world. As it happens, last week I took a group of students around the Africa rooms in the British Museum of a class I teach at King's College London, and we went and we looked at the Benin bronzes. And one of the things we discussed was that now those rooms in the British Museum have not. The exhibition has not been changed for at least 20 years. Nothing has changed in it, even though we know that there are large numbers of artifacts stored in the stores of the British Museum which never see the light of day. And that is symbol. And of course, it is not changing because everybody is aware in British and in European and Western institutions that this is a powder keg. But it shouldn't be a powder keg. It's actually an opportunity for healing of all different kinds. And in the lecture, I argued that, you know, in fact, what we need is a program of mass restitution of all these artifacts. You know, we know that there are museums in Nigeria which have been purpose-built in Benin City for this. There's a museum in Dakar which has been purpose-built. It's got to be part of the picture, I think, for you know. So the legal case is one thing, and it's very important, but it must go hand in hand with that as well, in order for the whole to begin to exercise some form of healing.
Okay. Now, Paul, a key part of the Ghanaian argument is that the slave trade created the very racial hierarchy that fuels modern police brutality and economic exclusion. So how can a UN vote on history solve the contemporary crisis of the African identity being criminalized in the West?
So it is all part of that denial, Darshan. They do not want to accept, because if they do, then they know the financial implication. But they shouldn't be doing that. And by the way, let me also mention here that apart from just pushing this at the UN, that President Mahama is supporting a newsletter on reparation, slave trade reparation, and then some people are working on it to make sure that, you know, make it a constant, you know, daily menu of not just one-off thing, or when we finish with this now, everybody goes to sleep. There has to be that sustainability and consistency. Be drumming into the world that unless there is healing, like Toby said, you can't get justice in this world. And because millions of people, and that has pushed Africa, not just the money, the people who we're talking about human capital that were shipped into slavery, into into plantations, working in faraway places for people who do not have any, you know, they have no right to claim what they have claimed. And on top of that, they also got paid for owning slaves. I mean, so this is part of the problem. That's it. So there is racism underneath. It could have been, you know, when you now reduce the people, the self-esteem and their integrity over time, it sticks. And that is what has happened. And that is why police in some places see blacks as what they do. But let me also tell you that you heard Toby what he said. It is not just the Africa that are appalled at what is happening. There are many people who are anti-slavery movement, people who see that there has to be an end, the healing, but there cannot be healing without justice. It has to be reparation. There has to be a way of the world acknowledging that there are companies in the U.S., you know, Tate and Lie and all that. I don't want to start naming them. All of them benefited They have not even talking about it. And by the way, it wasn't just the transatlantic slave trade. There is also the Arabic slave trade. The Arabs, they also collected Africans and castrated some of them so that they do not reproduce. This is the kind of enormous and inhuman treatment that African population has been suffering. Over the years, it was over 300 to 400 years. And then today you say, well, forget it. Meanwhile, there are countries like, there was payment for Holocaust and all that. So that happened even later years. Why is Africa the same? Part of it is because the Africans themselves have not come together to bring that strong force that the world cannot resist and continue to drum it everywhere, at every forum, UN, UNESCO, everywhere, so that you make it a point that you cannot be, they can't escape it. I think that is what it is. Let the civil society, let the academia, let everybody, every African, wherever you are, if you think that there is need, there is, and there is urgent need for that, to put an end to it for healing. Let me stop there.
All right.
I mean, if I could just add one thing, I would say it's time for the cart to pull the horse. You know, the horse is not being, you know, if we think of the horses as our leaders, they are not. Now, President Mahama is beginning to show that there's some leadership, but you know, other world leaders, as you said, Paul, have not. So it is time for as you said, the civil society to pull the rest of the leaders to see the importance of this.
All right. Now, I would also love to hear your final thoughts as well, Toby. If these reparations were ever granted, who receives them? Are we talking about direct payments to the descendants of the enslaved, or a development aid to African governments? And how do we ensure that this wealth does not simply disappear into, you know, the same corruption vacuum that critics of the African aid often point to?
Well, I don't think any of us individually can answer that question. It's clearly an enormous, I think all of the above, as you said, you know, clearly to the descendants of the enslaved, clearly in some form of structural framework to ensure a different economic future for the African continent. There are massive class dimensions to all of this as well, which we haven't really discussed. But, you know, all of that is a problem far vaster than we can enter here. But just to say that, you know, it is also true that many people have considered this over time, and if this is recognized, as it should be, as a major priority for all of the world in order to further the process of healing, you know, if many intelligent minds come together, I'm sure, you know, this is always raised as an issue. In fact, it's far too complicated, you know, how do we do it, etc. You know, if many intelligent minds come together, I'm sure something just and healing could be developed. All
right. Well, I think with that, we'd actually have to wrap up the show. But thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time. Thank you so much, Toby Green, Professor of African History, King's College London, and also Paul Ejime, African Affairs Analyst in London as well. Thank you.